Good morning. Thank you so much for coming today. It is rainy, traffic is a mess, and getting anywhere around New York City this morning is a journey. So I really appreciate it. I'm full of a lot of gratitude for all of you to be here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and talk a little bit about what it means to be engaged in the climate crisis as just a human on the planet. And talk a little bit about something that we did at the UN called the People's Climate Vote. And what happens when you start to ask people how they want their governments to tackle the climate crisis. So in my line of work, I work with a lot of policymakers, I work with heads of state, I work with ministers around the world who are all faced with this challenge. Even yesterday, the Secretary General held a meeting where he called presidents and prime ministers from around the world to sit in a room and say, what are we going to do? The headlines are terrifying. We can't open a newspaper, we can't turn on the television without seeing impacts that are completely related to the climate crisis. Yesterday, the government of Pakistan was sharing a little bit about what their journey has been just even getting to now this extended monsoon season that has now caused complete devastation. 1/3 of the country is underwater, and nearly 1,500 people have lost their lives, and tens of billions of dollars are in front of them in terms of the costs of what this extended monsoon season has left them with. And the reality about the climate crisis is that it is things like this that essentially are our dress rehearsal. This level of catastrophe, this horrific things that we are seeing all around the world, these are really just the beginning. Every single country, every single person on the planet will be affected at some point in their lives. And in particular, if you're a young person, you are looking at this and you're saying, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't cause this crisis. I want some real action. I want to know that my whole life isn't going to be shaped by this crisis. And so in this room yesterday, there was another part of the conversation. And this was how important it is for us to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement was a long time negotiated treaty. This wonderful moment in 2015 where the gavel came down and nearly 200 countries agreed to keep global temperature rise at 2 and ideally 1.5 degrees was really momentous and took years and years and years worth of negotiations. But the really important part of the Paris Agreement is something that has a very dry, wonky title, something called nationally determined contributions. Now I know by the time I got to determined, you probably fell asleep when I said that title, because what does that mean, nationally determined contributions? Well, it means that every country gets to choose how they're going to contribute to keeping global temperature rise at a level that keeps us safe. Nationally determined contribution. And so these are pledges. Every country signs up. You have to do this as a part of the Paris Agreement. You get to decide what's in your pledge, but you have to ensure that you are reducing emissions and you are increasing resilience to these impacts that have accelerated so much, like the ones that we're seeing in Pakistan. And this is really the Paris Agreement superpower, because what happens is that countries are meant to submit these pledges every 5 years, and they're supposed to get more ambitious every 5 years. And so even if a country sort of starts a little bit further away from where they're supposed to be, over time the goal is that it's a ratchet mechanism, and so all countries over time really start to align to cap this global temperature rise. But of course, as we have learned, especially over the last few years, we are running out of time. We don't have time. And so this is where the pressure comes in. These nationally determined contributions are a key part to everything that we need to do on climate change. This is what we will hold countries accountable for. This is still being very closely negotiated, but these NDCs are really meant to carry us forward. But we have to make them more ambitious, and we have to do them at a speed and scale unlike really anything we've ever seen before. So, at the United Nations, we launched something to help countries do this. It's called the Climate Promise. And the Climate Promise set out, really in the lead, this was September 2019. We had no idea that COVID was right around the corner when we started this. And we said, all right, for any country that wants to have an ambitious pledge, we're going to do everything we can to help them. We're going to do everything that we can to make sure that they have the technical resources they need, that they have access to networks and partnerships to be able to be as ambitious as they can possibly be. And we had a lot of countries come forward. In the Climate Promise, we're supporting 122 countries. It's about 85% of the developing world. And these pledges are really inspiring. You're seeing countries take moves to protect forests. You're seeing countries start to create green jobs. You're seeing countries start to really make bold choices when it comes to energy. And then, when the COVID pandemic happened, these NDCs also took on a new meaning. Because what does it mean to protect people in today's world? What does it mean to protect people from impacts of climate change? But what does it mean to protect them from health catastrophes like COVID? What does it mean to protect them today in a world that feels upside down, where inflation is crazy, where we are seeing energy prices soar, we're seeing food prices soar? What does it mean to have a plan? That instead of just sort of watching all of this happen, what does it mean to have something on paper and a plan that we can stick to? And that's very much what these NDCs are about. As we were supporting countries on these NDCs, something really interesting happened. Because we started paying attention to what countries were more ambitious, what countries were less ambitious, who was really sort of just talking the talk, and who was walking the talk. And we discovered something that was really critical. The most ambitious NDCs, the most ambitious climate pledges under the Paris Agreement, all have something in common. You want to know what that is? They had high levels of civic engagement. They spoke to a lot of people. They had huge numbers from young people. They had talking to gender groups to make these NDCs gender responsive. They were talking to indigenous and local communities. They were talking to the private sector. They were talking to people all across the country to get their inputs into how this target should look. And that is a really remarkable thing when you think about it. Because it means, generally, the more inclusive you are when you're talking about climate change, the more ambitious you're going to be in the end. And this is why I think also conversations like what Nest is hosting are so important. This idea of being able to bring people from all across society to be able to talk about this crisis, to bring what you've got. Maybe you are an entrepreneur, maybe you are an artist, maybe you're someone who's really just wanting to learn. We need you in this. We need you to be a part of it, because when you are engaged, these climate pledges get more ambitious. And when these climate pledges, as a part of the Paris Agreement, are more ambitious, we are closer to keeping ourselves collectively safe. And so this is another reason why I am so happy that you have decided to join us today at this conference. So when we talk about civic engagement and we talk about how people can contribute to things like these nationally determined contributions, you know, there's a lot of sort of, in the beginning, when you first start talking about this, it's a lot of lip service, right? It's okay, yes, we will have a workshop. We will have a panel discussion on a certain topic on climate change. These are all really great. But we really wanted to step up the pressure. We really wanted to give people an easy way to have a direct route toward world leaders, toward policymakers, to be able to really have a say in this, a meaningful say, and to have world leaders actually listen. and to be able to absorb what is being said to them very generously by people in their countries about how they want to solve this crisis. And so this is when we came up with the People's Climate Vote. When we started the People's Climate Vote, it was very much attached to these nationally determined contributions. We wanted to give people a say in how these NDCs were being created and what was in them, the level of ambition. And in the end, it became the largest poll in the world of public opinion on climate action. And this is really interesting because when you start asking these questions and when you start saying, hey, are you interested in making a difference with your country's national pledge on climate? People say yes. They want a say in this. So we did it in a pretty unusual way. We wanted to reach people where they are. We knew that we could post a lot of things on social media. We knew that we could post, we could start asking people, but we really wanted to get people that weren't necessarily thinking about climate change in their day-to-day life. And so we did something, and a lot of colleagues at the UN thought we were completely nuts, but we started engaging the gaming industry. The gaming industry is bigger than the film and music industries combined. And when I first heard that, I was like, what? Really? Like, there's that many gamers out there? And someone said, oh, no, Cassie, I bet you're a gamer too. And I was like, oh, no, like, I remember Super Mario Brothers, but I don't really remember much else. I don't have one of those sets. I don't, and they said, no, pull out your phone. Do you have a game on your phone that you play? When you're standing in line at the grocery store, do you have a game that you're in an elevator, your commute? Yeah, I've played Angry Birds, I'll admit it. And guess what? That makes us all gamers. Because those are games that are a part of our lives. And we really wanted to meet people there. So we created an ad. We created an ad that was actually asking a bunch of very serious questions on the climate crisis. And when you play a game like Angry Birds, I can admit openly, I play Angry Birds, and an ad pops up, and it asks you to play for 30 seconds. And then you go back to, your whatever level you're on, and you go back to your commute and all of that. We created one of those ads. And it would pop up, and it would ask a set of questions on the climate crisis. And it was incredible, the response. We did this in 17 languages. We sent it all around the world, 50 countries, over 1 million people responded like that. It was incredible. People just sort of in their day-to-day life, in an elevator, all of a sudden something pops up on climate, and they responded. They wanted to answer. And you can see here the scope of what we got. The diversity of these countries. We have large countries, we have small countries, we have islands, we have landlocked, we have across all of the continents. It's really incredible. And our goal was to be able to take the voices of people in every single place and land them on the desks of these heads of state as they're thinking about their pledge on the climate crisis. And what was so interesting about this, because the first question was, do you think climate change is a global emergency? And this is a very significant question. We've seen a lot of people start pivoting away from even calling it climate change to the climate crisis. The editorial boards of The Guardian, for example, have stopped calling it climate change altogether. They will only call it the climate crisis because that is the urgency at which we have to act. And so we wanted to ask people, do you think it's an emergency? 64% of people said yes. 2/3 of the world said yes, We think this is an emergency, and we want to do something about it. And then we asked people, okay, what do you want to do? And we gave people options. We gave people 18 different policy options. And I know Dr. Foley was here yesterday from Project Drawdown, and we used a lot of the information and the data and the research that had come out of Project Drawdown, out of IPCC, out of the SDGs. We tried to get our hands on everything about what are the 18 most powerful policies in the world. And we had 6 different categories. We had energy, we had protecting nature, we had transportation, we had protecting people, adaptation to a lot of the issues. We had green jobs, we had farms and food. And we had 3 policies for each of those categories, and people essentially got to pick. What do you want your government to do? And these were some of the top ones: conserving forests and land, investing in solar, wind, and renewable power, climate-friendly farming, and creating green businesses and jobs. And what's so interesting about this is people are responding to where they are. Because these are not all the same thing. People can say, no, the silver bullet is renewable energy. The silver bullet is addressing farms and food. No, they were responding to where they are, and they know that we need more than one thing. Because when we first started looking at these numbers, we thought, oh, 54%, is that high? Is that high? And our partners at the University of Oxford said, well, actually, there's something very compelling about this, because no one in the world voted for just one thing. On average, they voted for about 7 different policies out of the 18. That's remarkable, because this tells us that addressing the climate crisis means we have to look at this in a very integrated way, in a very holistic way, in a way that needs every sector at the table. It needs every person at the table, because there isn't just one way we're going to do this. And people are seeing that this transformation that has to happen is actually one that needs to bring all of these different pieces together. Another piece that was very, very interesting. Young people came out overwhelmingly in this poll. They all wanted to answer it. And they overwhelmingly, in every single country, said it's a climate emergency, and more young people than older people all said it was a climate emergency. That is very interesting, because something that was very important to us, and this, and you can see here in the parentheses, this under 18. It's in parentheses, but guess what happens when you're 18 in a lot of countries? You get to vote. In a lot of countries, when you're 18, maybe you start having a job for the first time. In a lot of countries, you start having money for the first time to spend. And so a lot of polls don't talk to people that are under 18. And it was so interesting, because these are people that aren't a part of voting. They're not a part of the workforce, but they have a very important say. And if you're here from the private sector, you think about what this means for future consumers. This is really, really important stuff. And so I think here's something that is really, really important about all of this, is that we sort of threw this out there, trying to ask the questions, trying to really help people feel engaged. And once we started getting all of this data, we started handing it out. We said, all right, whoever wants this can have this. And we packaged it across every single country, had a country profile, regions had a regional profile. We also did a profile across the G20, the group of 20 largest economies in the world, how all of this went out across island countries, how this came out across some of the least developed countries in the world. And the world leaders wanted to listen. This got to President Biden's desk. This was debated in Parliament in Japan. it was debated, it was talked about in the UK, it was talked about from world leaders. They are paying attention. And even when we get to the next round of negotiations that are scheduled later this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Egypt, we've been asked by world leaders to bring some of this data with them, because they know that the choices that they have to make as world leaders, all of these policies, we can talk about them, but these are very big bets to make in a very volatile world. Right now, energy systems, we talk so much about how you have to restructure entire energy systems. Our current energy system in the United States took 140 years. And we have to completely transform it in a matter of a decade. This is going to take an immense amount of money, of partnerships, of commitment, of political will that is consistent. This is really, really important. These are not small choices. And so to get world leaders to act, they know you have to have people with you. And with the People's Climate Vote, that's what we're setting out to do. We're going to do another one next year. I encourage you to be a part of it. Please make your voice heard. We're going to try to do this even in a much bigger way, so that we know that every single pledge under the Paris Agreement, every single time that a world leader starts thinking about what are they wanting to do as they move forward, that they know where the people in their country stand. Because when we do it together, we just might have the scale of transformation and the urgency of transformation that we need to achieve these goals. Thank you very much.